Hi, everybody. I am Daniel G. Aaron, Associate Professor of Law here at the Law School, and I'm going to continue the introduction of the Lee E. Teitelbaum Utah Law Review Symposium, Fireproofing the FDA, Power, Politics, and Public Health. I'm going to give you a little bit of a teaser of some of the ideas and events that you might hear about today. The first is, there's this article in JAMA, "The FDA's crisis is everyone's crisis." And this is authored by Patty Zettler and Nathan Cortez, two scholars that we're lucky to have here today. And they discuss how the FDA a few months ago lost 20% of its staff and the serious impact that could have on the agency. There are other reasons to think that FDA could be in a crisis, and that is something that I anticipate might be discussed today. I should say that's particularly important because even though the FDA might not be in your standard 1L classes, it has enormous importance as far as the American's health. And by some measures, regulates 20% of the economy. That includes drugs, medical devices, cosmetics, food, a lot of the things that we put in and on our bodies. And so the idea that FDA could be in a crisis is really a serious concern that we need to take seriously and evaluate. All right, here is another teaser. This is an article from Bloomberg Law just from a few days ago. DOJ rethinks reorganization tied to gender-affirming care probes. This probably sounds like it has nothing to do with the FDA, but it has a lot to do with the FDA. And that's because the FDA cannot enforce the law on its own. In most cases, it has to go to the Department of Justice, the legal enforcement arm of the federal government. The DOJ is in the process of reassigning many of its staff to different issues, including transgender healthcare. And so it's moved some of the people that enforce food and drug law to transgender healthcare, which potentially puts the American public at risk. As part of this effort, DOJ is eliminating its consumer protection branch, the branch that enforces food and drug law. Now, the DOJ would likely respond that it's going to enforce those laws through other offices. I think it remains to be seen whether that's the case, but this raises concern about whether FDA will be able to enforce the law and pull off ineffective or unsafe drugs that are on the market. All right, teaser number 3. This is kind of going a little bit longer term. There's this article last year about how Biogen, a pharmaceutical company, quits controversial Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm. Now, all FDA experts are aware of the drug Aduhelm and the controversy surrounding it. In fact, this was probably the most controversial drug approval in FDA's history, or one of them, certainly. In fact, it was so controversial that Medicare, a federal healthcare program, declined to cover Aduhelm except in clinical trials. Of course, the pharmaceutical company was not happy about that, but to see one arm of the federal government essentially rebuke another arm by declining to cover an FDA-approved drug was quite a stunning event. And so these are just teasers of some things that might be discussed today, trying to whet your appetite with a little amuse-bouche. Lastly, I want to say that this symposium is dedicated to my aunt, Sue Aaron. Sue was an inhabitant of the Bronx, New York. She was Jewish, and she lived in Riverdale, a Jewish community in New York. And this is her pictured at age 74, about a year before she died. She was coming down with early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and so she was desperate to try something. She tried a drug called Leqembi, or lecanemab, another Alzheimer's drug that's been the subject of some controversy in terms of its FDA approval. Within a few months, she developed severe cerebral hemorrhages and was when she was found obtunded in her home, she was rushed to the hospital and she didn't make it. And the doctors all agreed that her death was due to Leqembi. So I'm dedicating this symposium to her because she doesn't really have a voice in how the FDA evolves as an agency. And she passed away due to a drug. And so just to take her life seriously and explore a lot of the issues that are impairing the FDA or affecting the FDA at the symposium. I'm super glad that we're able to do that. A few more thank yous. I know Grant already had some thank yous, but such as it is, we have a lot of people to thank to make this symposium happen. First is our Dean, Elizabeth Kronk Warner, colloquially known as EKW. This symposium would not happen without you. Grant Boyden, our editor-in-chief, whom you just saw, Henry Flitton, who is our symposium editor, phenomenal contributions to make the symposium happen. Our events team, Tristan and Chris, have done so much. There's no way this symposium would exist without them. Our marketing team, particularly Henry, who also does some photography, as you'll see him today with some flashes. It's a good sign. On our grants team, Scott has been so phenomenal to make sure that we could get our funding applied to the symposium. Leslie Francis hosted our symposium dinner last night, which was a wonderful time. We have an incredible number of amazing speakers and moderators. I'm so grateful that you have been willing to participate in this really important symposium. So thank you. The Lee E. Teitelbaum and his family are just so valuable to our law school as well. They have funded our annual symposium, made sure that we're able to continue this tradition and explore really important issues in our society. So thank you to the Teitelbaum family. And lastly, thank you to Arnold Ventures that gave me a grant. Arnold Ventures is a philanthropy that's dedicated to evidence-based solutions to make our society better. So thank you to Arnold Ventures. With that, I'm now going to hand off to our wonderful dean, Elizabeth Kronk Warner.
Wow, thank you for those teasers. I realize now I'm between you and the start of this fantastic conference. So I'm going to be relatively short, but Boshu Anishinaabe, hello friends. It's so lovely to see all of you today at the Teitelbaum Law Review Symposium, which is one of our signature events of the year. I'm really glad that you can join us both in person and online. And as I like to do anytime that we come together, I do want to acknowledge that this land that we're on today, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, the state, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community activities. And it's so appropriate that we should be gathering here in the Salt Lake Valley, as this valley since time immemorial has been a place where peoples from all around have come together to gather, celebrate, share cultural traditions, share knowledge. So I'm really excited that we continue in that tradition today and that you're all here from near and far to participate in this incredibly important conversation, as Dr. Aaron specified. I do want to affirm some of his thank yous and just add my own. I want to first thank Dr. Daniel Aaron for his exceptional work on this conference and helping to pull it together. A big thank you to Grant and Henry for all their work. It takes a village to make this symposium happen, and it would not happen without the exceptional work of our amazing law review staff. I'm a little biased, but I think we have the best best law review in the country. So they're pretty fantastic. And then also this simply wouldn't happen without the ongoing annual support of the Teitelbaum family. And I do want to tell you just a little bit about Lee E. Teitelbaum. He was born in 1941 in New Orleans, Louisiana, a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College and a 1966 graduate of Harvard Law School. He later earned his LLM from Northwestern University Law School, which he attended on a Ford Foundation fellowship. He was the dean here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law from 1990 to 1998, and he was also the dean of Cornell Law School from 1999 to 2003. After he was done with his deanship at Cornell, he came back to the University of Utah, much to our excitement, and he held positions here at the University of Utah. He was really a noted specialist in family law and a prolific scholar. He wrote 3 books on juvenile courts, a case book on family law, and a number of articles on sociology of law and legal history, juvenile law, family law, evidence, and professional ethics. He also served on the board of editors for the Journal of Legal Education, the Law and Society Review, and Law and Policy. He was very active in the legal educational community and was a member of the executive committee of the Association of American Law Schools and a trustee of the Law School Admissions Council. So I'm just so pleased that we can continue to recognize him and his contributions and the many ways in which his family continues to support the College of Law. And it seems particularly appropriate that we should be having this topic in the symposium that was named for him, because given his interest in family law, and I think Dr. Aaron just did a fantastic job of demonstrating with his own very touching personal story of the interactions between the FDA and families. And so it seems like it's a really nice continuation of his traditions. So I'm just so very happy to have you here. Thank you for coming out and participating in this important discussion. And with that, I will turn it over for our first conversation. So Che Miigwech, thank you very much.
Thank you. Dean Kronk Warner, thank you. Professor Aaron, thank you. My name is Jim Rubel. I'm an adjunct professor here in the College of Law. My primary role is in the College of Pharmacy and School of Medicine here on campus. It's my pleasure to be the panel moderator for this first panel. I'll introduce the panel members and ask them to come forward and take a seat, and then we will get started with this first session. The first panelist is Shannon Brownlee. Shannon is a writer, journalist, author, a public intellectual. Her career spans 30 years and hundreds of articles about medicine, science, health policy. She is the winner of numerous journalism awards and has been published in media. Please, Shannon. Media outlets ranging from the New York Times Magazine to the Atlantic, Sunday Times of London, New Republic, Time, and the Washington Post. Shannon has also published multiple articles in peer-reviewed medical journals, and her book, Overtreated: Why Too Much Medicine is Making Us Sicker and Poorer. Shannon was named this book was named the most important economics book in 2007 by the New York Times. She holds a master's degree in marine science from University of California, Santa Cruz. She resides in the Washington, D.C. area. Welcome, Shannon. The next panelist will be Sara Gerke. Whoops, pardon me. Welcome, Sara. Sara is a professor at the University of Illinois College of Law. She is a scholar there. She also holds an associate professor at the European Union Center at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Her research focuses on digital and legal challenges of artificial intelligence and big data for healthcare at the edge of medical developments, such as clinical translation of stem cell research, biologic products such as Forgive me, my eyes are not what they used to be. Somatic cell tissues and gene therapy, reproductive medicine, such as mitochondrial replacement, and digital health more generally. She has more than 80 publications and through a list of impressive journals. Welcome, Sara. And Professor George Horvath. He is an associate professor of law at UC San Francisco. His scholarship focuses on medical device regulation, both at the FDA and through state tort and products liability law. In his first career, he practiced as cardiac electrophysiologist, a heart rhythm specialist, during which he worked extensively with implanted cardiac rhythm devices such as pacemakers and defibrillators. And he will address a handful of current problems in medical device regulation. So I'm going to step aside and give the time over. We'll begin with Shannon on this, but this is going to be the interface of safety and efficacy and how this is decided, how this is looked at the FDA. And Professor Aaron did a wonderful introduction. I would just like to add, as an underlying theme to all of this, as we process what that four-letter word is, risk. Right? Will be a theme throughout this day. Okay, Shannon, thank you.
Jim, thank you, and thank you for naming risk as one of the critical issues that we're going to be concerned with. So I want to thank the university and Daniel Aaron for inviting me to this, and the funder, Arnold Ventures, which does a lot of good funding. I appreciate them as well. And I also want to make an apology to those who I'm going to talk over the heads of. I'm sorry, I try to pitch this at a level that everybody can understand. And for those to whom all of this is really familiar, I apologize to you too. But I also apologize for journalism in general for your aunt's death. I don't think that the press made it clear how ineffective Leqembi and Kisunla and Aduhelm are. Two of them are still on the market, and they are remarkably ineffective drugs, and they have risks. And I don't think patients or doctors have understood what the risk and benefit ratio really was. So let's go on. Let's hope I do this right. Next. No, what am I doing? Do I want to hit enter? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one aspect of why the FDA needs to be fireproofed, and that's, and I'm going to do that by making the following argument. We can't trust the drugs that the FDA approves to be safe and effective. And when I say we, I mean patients, doctors, the public. And much of what I say today is going to be informed by a nearly 3-year journalistic investigation. I don't know how we managed to keep going for 3 years, but my longtime colleague Jeannie Lenzer and I are just now wrapping up the third story in the series. It's been published at the Lever, levernews.com, and I hope you'll read them. This is the short list of all the drugs I could think of in 5 seconds that have had questionable approvals. And Jeannie and I have been watching the FDA approve these drugs and many, many others. And we knew that this was just not a handful of drugs. We knew this was a systemic problem, that there are real problems with the regulation of drugs. But we also were concerned that it was going to be hard to get an editor to buy what we were saying. And so we created a database. We took all new molecular entities approved between January 2013 and December 2022, which was 429 small molecule drugs, biologics, vaccines. And we downloaded the information into a database and from the FDA website, and then we assembled a team of 4 expert reviewers who looked at the evidence the FDA relied on to approve all 429 drugs. And what they used for their criteria for looking at this approval process were the 4 foundational standards for whether or not you can trust the results of a clinical trial. So you need to, I'm not going to go into all the details. They're not terribly important unless you either already know them or you're interested. But the thing to know is that they're the 4 most important criteria out of 7 that are in FDA regulations. So our reviewers looked at the studies and determined if they fulfilled one, none, or all of these criteria. And what they found shocked even us, two cynical reporters. 73% of drugs approved by the FDA over this 10-year period did not meet the agency's 4 foundational standards for efficacy. More than half were approved on preliminary evidence. 55 had only one of the 4 standards, and 39 drugs met none of the standards. 23% of cancer drugs met none of the standards. So this seemed like kind of important. Oops, sorry, I screwed up. This is a non-Mac. I don't know either. Help?
There we go.
Okay, great. So these were pretty strongly indicative results of a real crisis in the science being used at the FDA. And it's important to understand, for those of you who don't know this, that there's no such thing as a 100% effective drug, and there's no such thing as a 100% safe drug. All drugs have some risk of harm and some risk of benefit. And what you want is to approve drugs. What we want as patients and the public is to have drugs that are more likely to benefit us than harm us. So the question becomes, why were all of these drugs approved on inadequate evidence? It's pretty clear, I think, that the FDA was abrogating its responsibility to ensure safety and efficacy if it's approving drugs on inadequate evidence. So to answer that question of why, you have to look a little bit at the history. And this is where I'm going to make a proposal that I maybe it'll be controversial, maybe it won't, but I think PDUFA was the beginning of the fall. It was the first bite of the apple. So this is a picture from the AIDS era. Some of you were not born. Most of you were not born who are in law school now during this period. But AIDS was raging, and it was raging mostly in one population, which is gay men. And the White House, the Reagan White House at the time, was ignoring the problem to a large extent, and the FDA kind of was too. But there was another problem at the time, which is that the FDA was hugely understaffed, and it was taking 2 and 3 years to review a drug, the evidence for a drug, to look at it whether or not it would approve the drug. So AIDS patients were dying waiting for drugs. And what happened was that the pharmaceutical industry teamed up with AIDS activists and began lobbying the FDA and Congress to pass a law, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. And the law was passed in 1992. And what it effectively did was it had the industry pay the agency user fees. Now, at the time, then Commissioner David Kessler felt the need to say to both Congress and the public that this is not about compromising the integrity of the agency. This is not about lowering scientific standards. This is only about getting enough money to be able to do our job. Well, I think Dr. Kessler was wrong, because it's very clear that around that time, since then, we've seen a pretty steep decline in the standards that the FDA uses for assessing drugs. I'm not going to go into all of the details of it, but it led mostly to what's called accelerated approvals, or it effectively put into law something that had already been starting, especially with pressure from the AIDS activists, which is accelerating approvals. And there are a number of mechanisms. There are 5, I believe, different pathways for accelerated approvals. But what many of them require is that you lower standards, that you basically say, well, we don't have to make sure that there's a clinical endpoint in the study, that you can look at laboratory measures rather than the things that actually matter to patients' health, and assume that those laboratory measures are an indicator that the drug actually will have a positive effect. It also meant, what happened at that period in the 1990s was that pharma figured out that patient advocacy groups could be quite powerful. They could bring a lot of pressure to bear on the FDA. Now, today we have 1 million patient advocacy groups. There's Duchenne's Muscular Dystrophy Association. There's the Alzheimer's Association. There's the Lung Association. There's American Cancer Society. There's 1 million breast cancer groups. There's 1 million prostate cancer groups. Every disease has a patient advocacy group. But in those days, there were really quite a small number of patient groups, and they all had been formed by patients and families. They were self-funded for the most part, or they had a few benefactors. And that began to change in the 1990s with the passage of PDUFA and the industry figuring out how powerful these patient groups could be. So the bottom line here is that pre-PDUFA, you mostly had to prove drugs worked before they got approved, before they got on the market. Post-PDUFA, you could prove drugs worked after they were already on the market. The problem is many, many drugs get on the market on the basis of preliminary evidence, and the FDA does not enforce its own rules that the industry has to do subsequent better tests to find out if it actually works. They basically leave drugs on the market in this state of sort of unknowing limbo where we don't know if they actually work or not. So this is a seismic shift. This is a really important seismic shift because it has effectively transferred the cost, both financial and physical, of drug development onto the public. And meanwhile, the pharmaceutical industry still gets to have the profit. But the public is bearing the cost of this post-approval uncertainty and need to do the research. This is a quote, and to tell you how profoundly the world has changed since pre-PDUFA, this is a quote from a fellow named, oops, sorry, now I have to go back. Can I do that? This is not intuitive.
I think it's speech.
Okay, great. This is a quote from a man named David Frank, who is a pharmaceutical industry consultant. And he wrote a short guide that was published by STAT called Failed Trials, Successful Drug. And he listed 10 examples of drugs that failed in their clinical trials. They were not shown to be effective in the clinical trials, and yet they got approved. Aduhelm was one of them, which is the Alzheimer's drug. Exondys for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is another example. And he went through what drug companies have to do in order to get a failed drug over the transom. And what they had to do was establish deep and credible relationships to convince regulators to overlook, discount, or reinterpret negative trial results. I don't need to read the slide for you, but it's really, think about what that's saying. That you can basically use relationships to get the FDA to approve your crummy drug. Sorry. So this is really an important shift. And this is part of what the industry has used to soften the scientific bar, to lower the scientific bar, is not only money, which it also poured into patient advocacy groups, which have then helped to lobby for this lowering of standards. But also, PDUFA also has effectively instituted more and more and more meetings with FDA officials, between industry and FDA officials. So there's a term that a professor of law and medicine at Harvard, John Hansen, uses called deep capture. And he developed this idea in his work looking at what the tobacco industry did. And most of you will not remember the days when people actually thought that cigarettes weren't harmful and weren't addictive. And this was one of the things that the tobacco industry succeeded in doing, is persuading people that they were much safer than they really are and less addictive. And I think the pharmaceutical industry, in its deep capture, in its net that it has spread for all of the players in the approval ecosystem, patient advocacy groups, the Congress, the FDA, they really have infiltrated every single one of those players in this regulatory network to basically make the tobacco industry look like amateurs, to tell you the truth. So that's why I say that PDUFA, in fact, was really kind of a critical turning point in terms of the regulation of drugs and the decline of scientific standards at the FDA. And the result being that we have all these drugs on the market that we don't know if they actually work or not. And many of them, in fact, all of them have side effects, and many of them have really serious side effects. So what is the current administration doing? If you read the president's 2025 mandate for change and the MAHA manifesto, you would think that they were all about reforming the FDA. They talk about reestablishing gold standard science, about radical transparency, get pharma out of the FDA, shut and lock the revolving door. None of these things are really happening. In fact, just the opposite is happening. And I can give you examples if you're interested in it. But the administration is, I think, this is a bait and switch. That it is saying all the right things that sound very populist, but it is not actually going to follow through. And that's a tragedy, because this is an opportunity. So journalists are generally not in the business of making recommendations, and since I no longer run a think tank, I'm not a health policy expert, but I'm going to make 3 small recommendations, maybe some bigger than others. Repeal PDUFA, excuse me. Pay for the FDA with taxes. We're the richest country in the world. We can tax to be able to pay for an FDA. I mean, imagine if the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was paid for by user fees. Imagine if the judge in the trial you're in was paid by the defense. This is an enormous conflict of interest. It is a continuing conflict of interest, and pretending that it is not a conflict of interest for the FDA is, I think, not really facing the reality of what's going on. Number 2, pass legislation to require full disclosure by patient advocacy groups. They are very secretive about their pharma money. It is very, very difficult to know exactly how much they're getting, and they are heavily influenced by their funders. And 3, don't be fooled. There aren't shortcuts to understanding and demonstrating efficacy. Real-world evidence is being trotted out right now. It's great for looking for harms. You can't find efficacy. It's an observational kind of study. Biological plausibility is something Marty Makary, who, full disclosure, is a friend and colleague. Biological plausibility does not count as efficacy, demonstration of efficacy. Surrogate endpoints don't count in many, many cases. So we've had hundreds of drugs approved, and the FDA really needs to be fireproofed. And I know that people on this panel and the other panels are going to have a lot of really important and interesting comments to make. So I hope I've kind of set the stage a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shannon. For questions, again, I want to encourage you to use the Slido app. I'll be monitoring those here, and we'll have those towards the end after all the speakers have had a chance to present their information. Sara, please.
Hi, everyone. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Aaron, for inviting me. And of course, the law review. It's a fantastic event, so I'm looking forward to listening to all of the different presentations. Now, we just learned about drugs and some of the issues. Now I'm bringing us to the AI world and talk a little bit about some of the how to navigate the regulation, also deregulation of health AML-based products, and some of the latest from the FDA. Now, I plan in my talk to talk a little bit about what the FDA has been grappling with, and try to tell you a little bit about the borderline cases between health AML-based products and medical devices, and in particular using mental health apps as an example. And I will also talk about some of the current regulation of AML-based medical devices, where we are right now, and what might happen in the near future potentially. Now, the FDA regulates medical devices, and so this means if a health AML-based product, so AIML machine learning, that's ML, is not considered a medical device, the FDA cannot regulate it, even if the FDA wants to. And so it's really important to understand the definition of a medical device. And of course, it's regulated in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in Section 201H1 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And here the parts that I highlighted in bold are important. So it's all about the intent, right? The intended use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease. And it also does not achieve its primary intended purposes through chemical actions within or on the body of man, and which is also not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purposes. So in particular, the last sentence here is very relevant to AI, because it says here that the term device does not include software functions excluded pursuant to Section 520. And so that's important. So the question is, what does 520 actually say? Well, Section 520 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually lists 5 categories of software functions that are not classified as medical devices, and so are not subject to FDA regulation. And these are software functions that are intended for administrative support of healthcare facilities, for maintenance or encouragement of healthy lifestyles, to serve as electronic patient records, to transfer, store, convert formats, or display data and results, and also clinical decision support software tools. Now, in particular here, the second exception and also the last exception, the clinical decision support software exceptions, these are very relevant to AI. Now, today, I would like to focus on the second exception here and talk a little bit more about direct-to-consumer AIML-based health apps, because many of those claim to fall under this exception. Now, we are really seeing right now a growing trend of incorporating machine learning and in particular generative AI into health apps, especially chatbots. And so the question here is, when is such an app actually considered a medical device? Well, as mentioned, if the health AIML-based app is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and does not fall under one of these 5 exceptions in Section 520, well, then it is a medical device. Now, even if it's a medical device, the FDA does intend to exercise enforcement discretion if it poses a lower risk to the public. Now, if the manufacturer claims that their health AML-based app is intended just for maintaining or encouraging a general state of health or healthy activity, and is completely unrelated to the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, or treatment of disease or condition, then the app belongs to the so-called first category of general wellness intended uses that is defined in the FDA's general wellness guidance, and then it's not considered a medical device and consequently not subject to FDA regulations. Of course, a lot of manufacturers claim that their health AML-based apps are not considered medical devices. Now, the US market has really recently been flooded with so-called therapy chatbots that often use generative AI, specifically large language models. An example of a therapy chatbot is Robot Health, which it promised, and that's a quote, to make mental health support radically accessible by building the future of chat-based AI wellness tools. Another example you can see on the right is Replica, which is an AI chatbot promoted for anyone wanting to meet, and that's a quote, they are AI soulmates, finding, and again a quote, a friend, partner, or a mentor. Now, both apps have claimed that they are not classified as medical devices and are not subject to FDA oversight. Indeed, if you look closer into the terms of services, so this is one of the parts of Robot Health's terms of service, they express several times that they are not considered a medical device, saying things like the content and the services provided are not intended to be used for medical diagnosis or treatment. Now, Replica's terms of service say it even more expressly. Replica is a provider of software and content designed to improve your mood and emotional well-being. However, we are not a healthcare or medical device provider. It's also worth mentioning that Robot Health actually recently shut down its therapy chatbot. Well, so far, over 1.5 million users have used the app over the years. Now, why did they shut down the chatbot suddenly? Well, the reason they shut it down was that they actually tried to get FDA clearance, likely to officially market their product as a therapy or a clinical device in the US, rather than just a wellness or mental health support tool. But the company realized pretty quickly that the significant costs and also time associated with running a trial for safety and effectiveness, which the FDA requested, was just too much. And so Robot Health mentioned that they faced too many challenges in going through the FDA for marketing authorization, especially in the absence of clear guidance on generative AI, because they wanted to start using generative AI in their chatbot. Now, due to all of due to really this flood of therapy chatbots on the US market that have not been reviewed by the FDA and also the associated risks, Illinois has recently taken action and passed the Wellness and Oversight for Psychological Resources Act, which has been effective since August 1st. And generative AI chatbots, if you think about them, they are designed to sound natural and really keep the conversation flowing, rather than guaranteeing safe and accurate advice. And that's a serious problem in therapy. So these systems can, of course, make up information, so-called hallucinations, agree with harmful or delusional thoughts, miss warning signs of a crisis, and even change how they respond over time in unpredictable ways. And there have already been some cases of people that actually developed AI-linked psychosis, believing that chatbot was sentient or even attempting self-harm after long interactions. Now, one famous example is this one here, the 20-year-old Chael. He used the Replica app to create his companion named Sara, and then he exchanged around 5,000 messages, and then after exchanging these messages, he broke into Windsor Castle in England on Christmas Day in 2021 with a crossbow to kill the Queen. He was just recently sentenced to 9 years. Another report talks about an AI-powered therapy chatbot that recommended to a fictional former addict, and that's a quote, to use a small hit of meth to get through the week. Now, Illinois is the first state here to draw a bright legal line. So AI can help with admin or background tasks, but cannot replace a human therapist. And it is also the first state that explicitly bans unsupervised AI therapy. Now, since we are in Utah, I thought it's also worth noting what Utah has done so far. And actually, Utah has also recently, in May 2025, passed a law on AI mental health chatbots. Now, unlike Illinois, which bans the offering of therapy or psychotherapy services unless conducted by a licensed human professional, Utah's law actually does not ban the use of such chatbots outright, but instead it imposes specific requirements for mental health chatbots powered by generative AI. Now, for example, it requires disclosure that the chatbot is an AI technology tool and not a human. And it also bans sharing very individually identifiable health information with third parties. Now, the FDA has also recently announced that it will hold an advisory meeting of the Digital Health Advisory Committee in November to discuss generative AI-based digital mental health medical devices. Notably, we are talking here about medical devices, so the FDA intends to discuss those apps that are classified as medical devices and are related to the mitigation or prevention of a disease or condition. So there will be no discussion about the borderline cases that claim not to fall under the medical device definition. Now, the FDA aims to address the opportunities and challenges of these generative AI devices to reasonably ensure their safety and effectiveness. Now, I want to shift a little and talk about those AI/ML-based tools here that are considered medical devices under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Because despite the exception in 520 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there are still AI/ML-based products that are classified as medical devices. And in general, the term medical device includes software functions. And we have different types of software functions. There is software as a medical device, so-called SAMD. There's software in a medical device, so-called SIMD. And then there's software used in the maintenance or manufacture of a medical device. And specifically, SAMD and SIMD are relevant in the context of AI/ML-based medical devices. Now, SAMD, so software as a medical device, is defined by the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, as software intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. So in other words, SAMD is standalone software. So the software itself is a medical device, and it's usually running by non-medical devices, smartwatches, smartphones, etc. In contrast, SIMD, that's software embedded in a medical device. You have here both software and hardware components. So an example is a software that assists in operating an insulin pump. But the majority of AI/ML-based medical devices that are currently being developed in the US are SAMD, so just software as a medical device, so standalone software. Now, if a health AI/ML-based product is a medical device, it will be categorized into one of three classes, class 1, class 2, and class 3, based on its risk. And depending on the class classification, you have different pre-market submission pathways. I won't say too much about it because maybe George will tell you more about the medical device space. But there is a so-called 510K clearance. That's for usually for class 1 and class 2 devices, unless they are exempt. There's a so-called de novo classification request for novel low to moderate risk devices, and also pre-market approval, the so-called PMA for class 3 devices. But what I want to highlight is that right now, at least the newest data shows that the majority of AI/ML-based medical devices, actually 96% of AI/ML-based medical devices, have been cleared through the 510K pathway. And why is this important to realize? Well, it's important because in a 510K, sponsors must only demonstrate that their device is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device, the so-called predicate. And often and typically, the FDA does not require clinical evidence. Now, the FDA has already permitted marketing of 1,200 AI/ML-based medical devices. The majority of those devices are in radiology right now, followed by those in cardiology and also neurology. Now, here are two examples, just to give you like a flavor of what has already received marketing authorization here from the FDA. The left one is a very famous example, Luminetics Core, formerly called IDXDR. So this is a medical device that uses AI to detect more than a mild level of diabetic retinopathy in diabetic patients. Now, the peculiarity of this system is it's considered considered autonomous, meaning its decision does not need to be reviewed by a primary care physician. There are also direct-to-consumer tools that are considered medical devices and went through FDA, like Apple's ECG app. But as I mentioned earlier, this is really one of the rare examples where we have an app that was which actually went through FDA. Most of them do not. Despite the FDA's authorization of over 1,200 AI/ML-based medical devices, there's really limited transparency right now around how many of these devices actually are currently being used in healthcare. And so many people ask this question, is AI overhyped? Actually, Stat recently reported, when asked that question, the former FDA Commissioner Robert Califf responded as follows. I hear way too much about the money. I'm not hearing a lot about human values coming through discussions. Almost all of the technologies being applied to optimizing the financial status of healthcare delivery entities or companies that are making medical products, and that's not aligned with equitable, better patient outcomes. So until someone puts a soul back in the system, I think it's going to get worse and worse. He was also not optimistic in the next several years that there's going to be any change in the Wild West for health AI. I'm expecting there to be some announcement in the near future about more deregulation in this area. So I will leave you with these thoughts, and thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sara. George, podium's yours.
Thank you. And let me echo everyone's thank yous. So I'm going to be talking also about medical device regulation. I'm going to be focusing more on what you can think of as more traditional medical devices. And I have to say, I'm sure that we're going to hear a lot today about some very hot topics. Reformulated pediatric vaccine schedules and drug approvals for indications that are very questionable. I don't have anything like that in the medical device space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 3 long-standing structural problems, features embedded in the statutory structure that compromise the FDA's ability to ensure that medical devices are safe. Then I'm going to layer onto that explanation a discussion about how the administration's ongoing reduction in force policies are likely to exacerbate these long-standing policies or problems. Then I'm going to give you a short wish list of statutory fixes that might address all of this. And at the end, I want to step back and offer up 3 relatively half-baked ideas that are going to be ultimately unsatisfying, but that I hope can help us to think through how we can achieve resilient change. So first, let me just give a little bit of background on device regulation. Sara covered a lot of it. But first, under the medical device amendments, in order to reach the US market, a medical device has to have a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. It's a somewhat lower standard than you see for drugs. It's easy for the FDA to find a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness for some products. Think Band-Aids and crutches. It's very difficult for FDA to find a reasonable assurance for some other devices. Think about a deep brain stimulator. All right, and so the way FDA regulation for medical devices is structured, as Sara pointed out, is that devices are categorized into one of 3 risk classes. And the level of regulatory scrutiny that they get before they can reach the market varies depending on that. So low risk or class 1 devices are almost all exempt from any FDA pre-market scrutiny, so they go straight to the market. At the other extreme, high-risk devices, class 3 devices, have to undergo very rigorous pre-market scrutiny under what's known as the PMA, pre-market approval pathway. And this typically includes, among other burdens, 1 or more large clinical pivotal trials that can convince the FDA that there is a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. For intermediate risk class 2 devices, there's a very different way that the FDA gets to a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. As Sara pointed out, what the manufacturer of a new device has to do is convince the FDA that its new device is a lot like that device that's already legally on the market. And in the parlance of the medical device amendments, the new subject device has to be substantially equivalent to an existing predicate device. The technology can vary somewhat, the uses can vary a little bit, but by and by, the device has to be quite similar to meet that substantial equivalence standard. And I'm going to focus on intermediate risk devices in the rest of my talk, in part because this is the largest set of devices that come to the market each year. For many, many years now, there have been over 3,000 Class 2 devices getting to the market through the 510K pathway that Sara mentioned. And because the 510K pathway has for a long, long time now been the subject of a lot of concern, calls for reform, even calls for outright overhaul. And so let me walk through 3 structural problems with device regulation. I want to begin with a couple of statutory gaps or flaws that let dangerous devices reach the market, which means expose all of us to potentially dangerous devices, at least relative to the benefits they offer. As Sara pointed out, the 510K pathway does not rely on clinical trials in the main to get that reasonable assurance of safety. Right? In fact, the numbers are that if you exclude diagnostic tests, only about 8% of 510K devices have gone through a clinical trial that showed that it was safe and effective. And that's, in large part, that small number is because of the statutory limitations under which the FDA operates. Its authority to require trials is limited. And so there's a sort of a very, very easy avenue here for unsafe technology to get to the market. Also, once a device is cleared by the FDA, it can now serve as the predicate for newer devices. It can serve as a predicate even if it's dangerous, even if its dangers are known, and even if it's been the subject of a Class 1 recall, the kind of recall that FDA declares only when a device immediately threatens human life or long-term serious adverse health consequences. So a manufacturer has a new device, they can point to an existing dangerous device as its predicate and get clearance for the market. And then later, the manufacturer has another new device and can point at that device as a predicate and another new device in this chain that's become known as piggybacking. And what this leads to is the possibility that unsafe technologies can literally propagate down through several generations of devices. And we've shown this in some circumstances. All right. Second problem I want to turn to is that there is a process that the FDA has to remove unsafe devices from the market, but it's a really resource-intensive and slow process. The agency cannot simply revoke a 510K clearance. If the FDA identifies an unsafe Class 2 device, what it has to do under a provision in the medical device amendments is to reclassify the device to a higher risk category. Right, so there's an unsafe Class 2 device that got to the market through the 510K pathway. The FDA can use this process to convert that device to Class 3 risk. The device would have had to have gone through the PMA pathway, which it didn't, so presumably it's got to be removed from the market, at least until the manufacturer can successfully navigate the more rigorous pathway. The problem with this is that the burdens on the FDA to do this are quite large. The FDA has to publish in the Federal Register a proposed order of reclassification. It's got to provide really extensive justifications for doing this. It has to convene a meeting of the relevant device classification panel, an oversight panel, and get them to sign off. It's got to accept public commentary, comment on public commentary. All of this has to be done, and the sign-off has to be at the highest level, at the director of the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health, the FDA subcomponent that regulates devices, and the FDA commissioner themselves. And so it leaves the agency with a usable but really resource-intensive process to remove dangerous Class 2 devices. And to give you one example, a number of years ago, some surgical mesh devices were identified as unsafe. These were Class 2 products. And it took the FDA for some of these devices about 7 years to go through the whole reclassification process. Right? The third issue I want to flag is that the FDA is under pressure to shift the production of information about device risk to the post-market period. All right, under what's become known as the least burdensome provisions that Congress first added to the medical device amendments in 1997. the FDA has to consider the role of post-market information, which means that we may be getting less information before devices can get to the market. Shannon talked about this with drugs. This is somewhat analogous in the device space. And it means that devices are reaching the market with their risk profile being far less well characterized than it otherwise could be. And so I think that all of these problems function synergistically to allow devices on the market, and we just don't have a good handle on what their risk profile really is. If this isn't enough, like the rest of the FDA, the Center for Devices and Radiologic Health has been hit by the administration's reduction in force policies. And I don't know the exact numbers, but CDRH has lost a lot of employees in the 2 rounds of RIFs that have hit it. And there's been a lot of attrition as well, people leaving. Surprisingly, maybe, we aren't seeing a slowdown in CDRH's pre-market regulatory work. They're still clearing devices for the market. They're still approving devices for the market at about the same rate they had been doing. This probably shouldn't be as much of a surprise, though, because that work, that pre-market work, is funded by a program analogous to PDUFA that Shannon had talked about. It's the MDUFA process. It's a medical device user fee program. Manufacturers who submit a device to the FDA for 510K clearance, de novo reclassification, PMA approval, they have to pay a fee. And under the agreement with the FDA and Congress, those funds are almost all directed toward the FDA's pre-market work. The reason the industry agreed to pay user fees was because it realized that was a way to speed its devices to the market. And so what this does is it somewhat insulates the pre-market evaluation work that CDRH does from these reductions in force. But I think there are real reasons to worry about CDRH's ability to do its post-market safety assurance, to make sure that manufacturers conduct the studies they're required to conduct on the devices that reach the market, to identify dangerous devices that are on the market, and then to deal with those devices, because these functions are not in any substantial way supported by user fees. So what can we do? Well, there are plenty of potential solutions that you can come up with, that many of us have come up with, that rely on statutory reforms. I mean, my own personal wish list, would read something like increasing funding and staffing for CDRH, expanding FDA's authority to require clinical trials for 510K devices, right? Setting up a mechanism for a periodic formal submission and review of safety data for devices that have been on the market for a while. Streamlining the process for FDA to pull devices off the market, limiting the scope of the least burdensome requirement to shift information to the post-market phase. I could go on, right? But as we know, even in the best of times, passing a package of substantive reforms like this really requires a rare alignment of the legislative stars, which sort of tees me up to talk about 3 observations, suggestions, whatever. The first is that many statutory reforms, including everything on my wish list, are only going to be feasible during some narrow windows of time. And what we've seen historically is that major changes to or expansive of FDA's authority have happened in these narrow windows of time after highly publicized public health catastrophes. Childhood deaths because of contaminated antitoxins, childhood deaths because of untested drugs, right? We don't know what's going to open up the next legislative opportunity. We don't know when it's going to happen. And as this is as much a criticism and a challenge to myself as an exhortation to everyone here, we all are fond of writing papers that identify problems and vaguely suggest some solutions, but we need our proposals to be very well worked out, right? Committed to paper and public. Because when the next legislative opportunity opens up, it's not going to stay open for long. And so we want to be able to move quickly. All right. Second is that we also need to think broadly and creatively about where opportunities for statutory reform might currently exist. All right. And so let me just offer one thought. The current medical device user fee program, which is under the 5th iteration of the MDUFMA statute, the medical device user fee statute, is set to sunset in September of 2027. It's critical that this program get renewed so that devices can continue to reach the market in a timely fashion. And given all that's going on, it wouldn't surprise me that the industry might be a bit more receptive to increases in the user fees if that's going to mean that their devices can continue to navigate the pre-market processes in the face of all these reductions in force. So my idea here is that the next iteration of INDUFMA ought to expand user fees and use some of them to support CDRH staff work on post-device safety, effectively decoupling that work from congressional inertia or executive policy. Now, there's a very different political economy here. I think manufacturers are much more likely to see post-market regulation in this space as having downsides. You're going to identify more device problems, call more recalls, pull devices off the market. But there are a couple things that are happening right now. And the main thing is that the FDA is starting to solicit stakeholder input for formulating the next version of the user fee program for devices. And so this may be an area of opportunity. The last suggestion I want to offer is that we take a step back and keep in mind what the ultimate goals are. And to me, the ultimate goals here are that we ensure that medical problems like devices, drugs, and biologics are safe, effective, innovative, and available. The FDA is a critically important tool and a unique tool that we can use to achieve those goals. But there are other tools as well. And I just want to offer one thought. I had talked about the way devices are reaching the market with their true risk profile very poorly characterized for all of the reasons I discussed. But this problem is being compounded by physicians' rapid adoption of new technologies. All right, so we've seen in the last several years, we've seen physicians implanting tens of thousands of brand new metal-on-metal hip prostheses, hundreds of thousands of brand new cardiac defibrillator leads, all within 2 or 3 years of those devices reaching the market, well before the actual safety and risk profile of these devices could be understood. And so my suggestion in this area is that we, all of us, engage with physicians, trainees, medical educators, not to tell them what drugs and devices to use, obviously, but to help them to understand how regulation actually works, where it falls short, and how their individual choices, like how early to adopt a new technology, can exacerbate or mitigate these kind of regulatory shortcomings. I know this is all piecemeal. I promised you it would be ultimately unsatisfying. I think I met my benchmark. But I hope it gives us something to think through as time goes on. So let's do some Q&A.
Thank you, Shannon, Sara, and George. Very enlightening, many aspects of this. Professor Aaron, I think the challenge throughout the day is going to be the delivery of the content balancing against the number of questions coming through. So I've been watching the questions. I have erred on letting the questions come through so that everybody can see them on there, but we may only have time for 1, at most 2 questions. So, and what the panelists may not know is individuals have been voting on the questions that they kind of like the best. So, recognizing that it could be a politically charged element, we have a unique case example going on right now with respect to evaluating the safety of a drug that's been on the market for 60, 70 years, and that's acetaminophen, the brand name Tylenol. So the question that came through is, given the president's recent claims about the link between Tylenol autism, several lawsuits have ensued. Will the FDA play any part in clarifying the effects of this particular agent? It's not directed to a particular panel member.
Well, I know my answer. I have no idea. I mean, it's an old drug, and what we should have had was a more robust post-market surveillance system, which we don't have either in drugs or in devices. So it's hard to know what the FDA would do and wouldn't do, but we do know that they don't have the information that they need, and neither does anybody else, really.
I would just pick up on one thing that Shannon just said, which is that there is another serious limitation in FDA's ability to ensure safety and effectiveness are the limitations on getting the information about when a drug is unsafe, when a device is unsafe. It's actually really hard to get this information, and there are many systems that are in place to try to do that. In the medical device world, it's estimated that the early estimates were that only a fraction of a percent, I mean literally less than 1% of all device-related harms were being reported as they were legally required to be. Those numbers have improved over the years, but even just at the base level of getting that information, relying on sort of post-market reporting is always going to be a flawed strategy. It's a good complement. It's not the ultimate answer, though.
Can I just go back to the device post-market surveillance? Other countries have registries, and we don't. And Home Depot tracks a box of nails better than we track an implantable medical device. And so one solution to the post-market surveillance problem would be having registries, but industry doesn't like registries. And when we do have registries, we do have a registry right now for the Alzheimer's drugs, they're totally non-interoperable. One registry here, one registry there, one registry there, and you can't really compile all the data to be able to understand what's going on.
Jim, as a pharmacy expert, can you opine on this?
Let me give you, I don't know if this, let me give you something that happened to me in my career. A very dear professor who's now retired from the College of Pharmacy, MD, PhD, medical toxicologist. He ran the poison center here for decades. He made a statement to us one day in class that said, if aspirin came before the FDA, it would never be approved today. It's too dangerous of a drug, given the amount of data coming in through a poison center regarding the impacts of it. So aspirin is a drug that has never been formally approved by the FDA. It was grandfathered in. So I think we have this sort of interesting world about how risk is going to be apportioned and who bears the risk. So I would just say what I hear from everyone here is the thoughtfulness about the paradigm of the regulatory analysis of the risk and who should bear that risk. So I don't want to take time for my comments. There's one other question here that I'd like to see if we. You're not on. Oh, thank you very much. There, thank you. The last question I think we have time for here and to break is about the power and the influence of outside money across regulatory agencies. So consumer groups was mentioned, certainly the industry perspective on this, about ways, and Shannon, you mentioned conflict of interest. I think all three of you at one point or another mentioned getting a better handle on conflict of interest as it influences decision making. I don't know if you could comment if there are ways for the FDA to look more closely at that.
There are lots of ways. I mean, for example, advisory committees. The FDA has these standing advisory committees, which I unfortunately think are going to be a thing of the past, which is a real tragedy because they're one of the windows on FDA decisions that the public has. But advisory committees are made up of outside experts, and a lot of academics and some journalists who are more advocates than journalists like me, have been advocating for a long time that you can find experts who do not have conflicts of interest with industry. And it's pretty clear that, that the FDA has not had any interest in doing that. So now Marty Makary has announced that they're going to get rid of conflict of interest in the advisory committees. And when you look at the advisory committees that now still exist, and the ones that were during the Biden administration and various ones before, the ones during the Biden administration and earlier administrations had lots of conflict of interest, and now they have even more conflict of interest. So yes, the FDA can do things about conflict of interest, but the fundamental conflict, I think, is PDUFA and MDUFA.
So a couple of things. I think that, first of all, historically, we know that FDA has gone through sort of cycles of openness and resistance to industry input. Professor Daniel Carpenter has a book, FDA, Reputation and Power. I think it's this really incredible history of the FDA. And part of it talks about eras where the FDA doors were wide open and industry representatives literally could barge into FDA personnel offices and sort of jawbone them about their products. And so we've seen those kind of fluctuations. On the other side, at least in the device space, there are, I think, some fairly respectable arguments to be made that contact with industry does help FDA personnel understand particularly newly developing technology. And so how to draw the line there is a very difficult question. But I think there's an even bigger problem here. I mean, yes, industry influence on FDA is big, but also, right, we now depend on industries to fund all of the basic research that establishes whether drugs and devices are effective, how they're developed. And so there's a much larger ecosystem of influence that no matter how successful we might be at the FDA, we're still swimming against a really powerful current, unfortunately.
I think that's time. Is that? Yes. I want to thank the panel. Shannon, Sara, George really helped educate me today as well on new concepts, new elements about perspectives. Thank you very much.